Okay, thank you very much. This is Matt Radulski. Let me go ahead and move my screen a little bit so that I can bring the camera up. Okay. There you go. Okay, good. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight for what will be a very interesting talk, especially for you Indian Neck people and all of us who love Indian Neck, which has to be everybody in Branford. I've spent lots of great days in the water, on the shore, down in Indian Neck. So we really thank Jane for being prepared to present this talk in what's not really an optimum way, but it does help for those of us who would rather be at home in our slippers instead of out driving on a cold, wet, rainy night. My thanks also to all the library staff, to Karen and Jenna and everybody else who's helped and is doing the hosting tonight. Couple notes, you should be receiving your membership renewals in the mail shortly. Please do go ahead and get those in very promptly. It really helps the people who count them when they come in, because of course they get busy at the holidays too. So please take care of that as early as possible. If you have friends who you know like to support great Branford institutions like the library and the Historical Society, please urge them to join, because our funds right now are low with the lack of the Strawberry Shortcake Festival and the annual dinner meeting and all that stuff. So please just encourage your friends. Ask them, are you a member of the Historical Society? And if not, ask them to go ahead and join. They can do it online very easily or get directions online. So enough of that right now. Let's not pause anymore or hold up Mike Russo, our programs coordinator, who's put together a great set of programs this year despite the obvious many challenges. Mike, you have the floor.
Yeah, welcome everybody. This is our second Zoom meeting now. Hopefully we're getting a little bit better at it, but I do want to thank Jenna especially for walking us through it and holding our hand a little bit so we could get this done. And Jane was, thank you for your willingness tonight to do the program online. I really don't think Jane needs any introduction. If you're a member of the society, you certainly know Jane. She's been around in many different capacities, and she is the town historian, obviously, and she's just the treasure trove of information. So I'm sure we're all going to have a wonderful time tonight at this Indian Neck presentation. So Jane, take it away.
Right. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us for this program this evening. I have a personal connection to Indian Neck. My mother's grandparents moved from Branford Center to Indian Neck about 1905. And until my late teenage years, I spent at least one day a week down visiting my grandmother and my two uncles. So I'm pretty partial to Indian Neck. And so where is this place, Indian Neck? Branford was settled in 1644 by the English coming from New Haven and Wethersfield. But of course, the native people were here for thousands of years before they came. And when the English came to Branford, a small band of Indians were living at Indian Neck in the peninsula southwest of Sybil Creek, and they became known by the English as the Totoket Indians. The Indians had already had experience with the English for at least a decade, and the Branford settlers and the Totoket Indians cohabited Branford for almost 100 years. The Indians finally, slowly over time, sold their land to the English colonists of Branford, and the final sale was by Possum, the sachem of the Totoket Indians, in 1735. So in actuality, Indian Neck is the peninsula that's Linden Avenue, southwest of Sybil Avenue. But we think that Indian Neck has a broader definition. Indian Neck Avenue starts almost in Branford Center. The Indian Neck schools were on Indian Neck Avenue. And so if you ask probably 10 people who live in Indian Neck today, you probably will get 10 different answers of where Indian Neck really is. The first family to really settle in Indian Neck permanently was the Pond family, and they built a house in 1812. And then slowly, starting in the 1840s, Indian Neck became a destination for summer tourists, and that really ramped up in the 1880s. Before we really start, I need to tell you, since this program is based on postcards, a little history about postcards in the United States. Postcards really were started in Europe, and it was not till 1898 that the U.S. Postal Service approved the use of postcards through the U.S. mail. And these at first were private mailing cards that businesses would use to advertise their goods. And then as the shoreline area became a summer resort, we got picture postcards, such as this one. There were manufacturers that were national manufacturers, but also local. This card is by John Morton of Branford. He was the pharmacist at the pharmacy in the center of town and also a professional photographer. And he did many, many Indian neck postcards. I have in my collection just over 600 Indian neck postcards. No doubt there's a few more. Of course, photography at this time was black and white, and this postcard was hand colored and then mass produced. The other main manufacturer of Indian neck postcards was Charles Lonsbury, and this is very typical of a Lonsbury card with the white border and kind of a fuzzy patina to the postcard itself. I know of at least 100 Lonsbury cards. And then there were also specialty cards that we call as collectors real photo postcards. I just obtained this card on eBay about a month ago. It was a thrill, I can tell you, because it's a gorgeous card. You can barely make out in pen that somebody wrote Indian neck. And I, of course, recognized the cottages immediately as being on Limewood Avenue. So real photo postcards could be mass produced or like this one of a kind. And then there were also humorous postcards, such as this one. I'm a big fan of this postcard. On the back of this postcard, a man wrote, "I didn't quite know whether I should mail this card for fear I'd be arrested for sending objectionable material through the mails, but one gets tired of the same views year after year." And were that person living today, wouldn't they be surprised what is not even considered objectionable material anymore? And then lastly, starting about 1960, this variety of postcards are called chromes. And this is a postcard that still would be in use today, though we don't send postcards very much anymore. Now, these postcards had little teeny boxes, of course, to write messages, so you couldn't write very much, but almost always the card began, such as having a dandy time, having a delightful time, a fine time, everything is lovely, and my favorite, having a peach of a time. If the week had been rainy, that certainly was noted, wish the sun would come out, and the postcard almost always ended, wish you were here. So the goal for the presentation tonight is to have a little walking tour through Indian Neck via the postcards down Sybil Avenue to Limewood, and then back over to Sybil Creek, down Linden Avenue, Summer Island, Sunset Beach, and then end at the Montowese House. And so how did you get to Indian Neck? Well, in the early days, you would have come by stage. And those stages were not like the Wild West movies where you had a stagecoach. These were really wagons with just a canvas top, and a livery man would pick you up at later at the train station and bring you down to Indian Neck. The train came through Branford in 1852, and again, the wagon would pick you up. The main livery person was Daniel Beardsley of Branford Point. And then, of course, later, there was the trolley. And you would take the trolley from Branford Center down a little bit down Old Pine Orchard Road, and then through the meadows in back of South Montowese Street. You could get off at Sybil Avenue, all these different stops along Limewood, and then eventually the trolley would go on to Pine Orchard. The trolley extended back to Pine Orchard and Indian Neck in 1906. And then, of course, after that, the automobile came, and the automobile really changed, making the shoreline a destination. People started going out west and beyond instead of coming to the shore. And why did people come? Well, they come to go on vacation like we do today. For meeting their extended family, to have fun. It was definitely cooler in Indian Neck than it was in Waterbury of Hartford, to the tune of 12 or 15 degrees. Boating, going to relax, go clamming and fishing, and so on. And so here's a great real photo postcard of a cottage in Indian Neck with the extended family. I'm particularly fond of the hairdo on the woman on the right in the front row. And then I have to say that man has a pretty awesome mustache. But they came for other reasons. The back of one of these postcards in 1907, there's lots doing here, clams and girls. And in 1911, lots of boys here. I met 10 last night at the dance. Don't know their names. They were all fine except one. And where did people come from to come to Indian Neck? They came from the manufacturing cities of Connecticut, Waterbury, New Britain, Hartford, and then also a lot of people came from Springfield, Massachusetts, and Holyoke. And so would you please imagine with me that it's 1905, the heyday of the summer resort was between about 1900 and World War I, when the most postcards were made and sent in the mail. So 1905, you and your family are coming to Indian Neck for a week to spend some time at the shore. So after getting picked up at the train station, our first stop is Sybil Creek. Now, Sybil Creek, there's some controversy as to how that name came about. Some have said that it was the name of an Indian woman, though there's no record in the records of that a woman by that name. But there's notes from the Foote family of Branford Center that are over 100 years old that says the creek was named for Sybil Foote, and there was indeed a woman named Sybil Foote. And so you would get dropped off here at the Yale store, and this is what we're looking at straight ahead is Linden Avenue. To the left is Sybil Avenue. And so this is on the right, just beyond today's Lenny's restaurant. The Yale store opened in 1904 by Lewis and Elizabeth Barbary of East Haven. And they ran the Yale store off and on, though not consecutive, for 30 years. And here is a place that you could get groceries, what they called confectionaries, baked goods, candy, ice cream, and so on. And this, remember, is before there were big grocery stores, that this is the kind of place you would go to get your supplies. In 1929, the Barbary family added a mini bowling alley. There was pinball machines, an electric piano for dancing. And then a little bit later, you can see that Ann Cleto had a beauty salon here at the Yale store. And in 1942, Phil had a barber shop, which he called the sanitary barber shop. I don't know what makes a barber shop sanitary versus not, but nonetheless, that was Phil's barber shop. In 1935, the Hyder brothers from Branford opened the market part of the Yale store, and you can see some of the signs. Yale store with the Siemens ice cream, which was a big ice cream manufacturer in New Haven. And then a little bit later, this is in 1958, you can see a little addition was built to the right-hand side of Yale store. And for 1 year, this man, George, who's laying across the chairs, had a little hot dog stand, Hummel's hot dogs, hamburgers, French fries. And that was only here for 1 year. And the following year, the Yale store closed. In 1960, by 1960, it was torn down. It was an Amoco gas station. It was a Cumberland Farms. And for a couple decades, it's been a variety of different restaurants. Now, across the street from the Yale store was the Indian Neck General Store. That was built about the same year, 1904, by Anthony Marinelli from the center of Branford. The Marinelli family had a grocery store uptown, and it was run by his son, Bruno Marinelli. And you can see, of course, Bruno's snack shop off on the right. And again, here you would buy your groceries, your supplies for your summer vacation, and also get ice cream, hot dogs, hamburgers, and the like. From 1935 to 1952, Cliff Mitchell and Louis Wagner ran the general store, and they built and also ran the Indian Neck package store, which still exists diagonally across from the market. Peter Kaplan was the proprietor from 1954 to 1962, and then it became known as Peter's Store. He retired in 1962, and he said he didn't regret retiring, but he regretted that he wouldn't see any longer the nicest kids in the world. Harry Stitney was the proprietor from 1966 and retired in 1979. And all these proprietors were very generous with their time, very kind to the local residents, and very generous, donating ice cream, candy, and so on to the Indian Neck Fire Department for various Indian Neck events. Since 1997, this has been a restaurant, and there's been a variety of different restaurants at this location as it is today. Now, as we head down toward Limewood Avenue, we go down Sybil Avenue, and Sybil Avenue was one of the first places where cottages were built in Indian Neck. Matter of fact, one of the cottages here was called the Pioneer Cottage. And what we're looking at here, coming from the right, that is Linden Avenue, and then we round the bend, and we're facing then west, going down Sybil Avenue. And you'll note, of course, the trolley tracks coming right down Linden Avenue. You could rent a cottage here on Sybil Avenue. It was a very short walk down to our next destination, and that was Limewood Grove. Now, Limewood Grove was a very popular summer destination. There was many cottages you could rent fairly reasonably, and these were cottages and 3 different hotels for middle-class patrons. Very affordable. You could do bathing, boating, and like I said, there were many different cottages that you could rent. One of those was, as you come around Sybil Avenue down Limewood, at the corner were the Anchor Cottages. And this was run by Levi Frost of Indian Neck, and then his daughter, Cornelia, who had married Claire Bradley from Stony Creek. In the back of this house, they built the Compass Restaurant. Now, the Bradley family was associated with the famous Oasis restaurant of Branford, and they ran the restaurant for about 10 years. It closed in 1951, and this became a private dwelling. But the restaurant was there until only about 10 years ago, a long, thin, rectangular building that was vacant for many years. All this was torn down, and within the last decade, several new houses have been built on the site. As we go down Limewood Avenue, again, note the trolley tracks. There was very briefly, this little theater, the Indian Neck Theater. This would be where they would show lantern slide shows. And at first, there was no roof, and you could hardly stand in the summer because of the mosquitoes. So they finally had to add the roof. Now, this would be what is today the west corner of Waverly Road. And of course, Waverly Road was not there in the early 1900s. But in 1920, the theater was torn down, and Edward Heibel of Holyoke, Massachusetts, built the Waverly Hotel. And of course, many of us remember this 25-room hotel with a grand dining room and a nice porch overlooking the water. He lost the summer hotel during the Depression, and that's a common thread during the Depression, that a lot of these summer hotels were lost to foreclosure. But then subsequently, it had many different proprietors. And by the 1950s, the owner of the Waverly was Myrtle Braxton. She was known as Myrt. Many of us will remember her. She liked to go clamming, cooked all her own food for the people staying at the motel. And I remember, as a member of the Branford High School band, that we used to lead the annual Indian Neck Halloween parade for the little children and end up at the Waverly, where the children would receive their bag of goodies. Like so many other of these summer hotels, the Waverly got run down. It was very expensive to maintain these buildings, and they were starting to get old. And there was a fire here in 1975. Myrtle Braxton was there, but did get out, and it could not be repaired. It was torn down, and new houses put in its place. One of the favorite locations along Limewood Avenue was Lonsberry's store at 70 Limewood Avenue. And this was started in 1912 by Charles Lonsberry. Now, the Lonsberry family were the people that owned and operated the Oenigo, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. They were a newspaper dealer, had candy, Western Union, they rented cottages, sold groceries, and then you can see that even when automobiles started, they started selling gasoline. Lonsberry's, as I mentioned, was the main producer and dealer of postcards, numbering over 100. But this is the only postcard I know of that shows Lonsberry's store, and I wish there were more that showed it even a little better than this card does. After Charles retired, his son Louis and his wife Evelyn ran the store, and Louis was one of the first people in New Haven to deliver to the homes the New Haven Register, first in a cart, and then he had a big open silver touring car. Evelyn ran the grocery store part, and this was an ice cream snack bar, ice cream soda fountain, and maybe some of you remember those from the candy store up in the center of Branford, or Dunbar's, which was a counter with stools. And my mother, as a teenager, worked for Evelyn Lonsberry making ice cream sundaes at the soda fountain. And she's famous in our family to this day for making really good ice cream sundaes. But if you wanted a glass of water, you were charged a penny extra. Lonsberry also had a fleet of boats, which were called the Eagle Fleet, these small boats that people would rent to go rowing when they came for vacation. Now, one of my uncles worked for Lonsberry's also, managing these boats, hauling them, and so on. And we'll talk a couple times about the 1938 hurricane. And my uncle went down to help Lonsberry's pull their boats during the storm. And of course, my grandmother was extremely worried, because what it must have been like hauling boats during that storm, it's unimaginable. In this postcard, you can see we're looking at, to the far right, Haycock Point, a landmark identifying Haycock Point. I'll mention here that I've been asked a number of times through the years that Limewood Beach is sometimes called Scum Beach, which isn't a very nice name. And why is that so? Well, I don't really know. Is it because when there's a lot of seaweed on the beach, it's kind of slimy, so kind of scummy? Or is it in Short Beach, there were problems starting in the 1920s of what they considered undesirable people coming to the beach and leaving a lot of trash behind? Is that why this beach was called Scum Beach? I don't really know. From a postcard in 1911 of Limewood Avenue, we go bathing, rowing, and clamming every day. The Lonsberrys retired in 1962, and the store was made into a home, and it's still there today. Now, across from Limewood Beach is Green Island, and this little building was built in 1903 by Dr. Edward Gallaudet. Now, he was the founder of the School for the Deaf in Washington, D.C., which still exists today, and his mother, Sophia Fowler of Guilford, was deaf. They also had a larger summer cottage on Linden Avenue, and this camp burned down about 1910, probably arson. The Gallaudet's son married Elizabeth, the daughter of A.M. Young of Pine Orchard. So Green Island was just a island of land for many, many years, and then a new house was built on this island in 1989 and still stands today. The island was officially renamed in 2012 Helix Felix Island. I don't know what the significance of that name is, but I know for me, it will always be Green Island. This is after the fire of the Gallaudet camp. And so you could rent many of these different cottages all along Limewood Avenue, and a little bit later on Wilford Road and Waverly Road, which were put through about 1920. And then also along Limewood, there's all these kind of funky little almost driveway that don't have street names with little cottages on them. And some of those are still there today. A little bit later in the 40s and 50s, you could go, besides Lonsbury's, to Madeline's restaurant, have a steak dinner and some refreshment. Again, from some of the postcards, we are having a delightful time. The children are getting fat as pigs, and I look like a lobster. Another one of the stomping grounds along Limewood Avenue was first called Buckingham Palace of the Buckingham Station, and more commonly and later called the Pioneer Store. Here you could get ice cream, burgers, there was a soda fountain, and of course, bathing supplies for the beach. This was right on the beach. And here's a view looking from Haycock Point west along the beach. This is a pretty early postcard, and you can see that the first cottages along Limewood were right in that center part. And to the right, there's no cottages yet, and way to the left towards Sybil Avenue, there's no cottages. And the Pioneer Store is right there in the middle, right on the beach. This building, the Pioneer Store, was later the Surfside restaurant that served spaghetti grinders and so on. And then some of you will remember it as the Dairy J from 1962 to 1977, where you could get ice cream and other refreshments. The building was gone by 1981. I do not know if it was taken out in a storm and damaged, or if it was just torn down because the era of coming to the shore for vacation was really over, certainly by that time. The most famous of all the places along Limewood Grove or Limewood Avenue was Palmer's Casino, also called Palmer's Grove. Palmer's Casino was built in 1899 by Susie Palmer, and she was the wife of James Edmund Palmer, known as Eddie. Eddie Palmer owned a lot of land on South Montowese Street before you get down to today's Lenny's. And my other uncle worked at Palmer's Casino as a teenager checking coats and hats. And he said people called Susie Palmer Biddy, but never to her face. And he said that Biddy never shared the tips for the coat checks. So when she wasn't looking, they'd each take 5 cents out of the glass jar. The late Bob Bescher lived and grew up across the street from Palmer's Casino, and he called them Ma and Pa Palmer. Now, he said that he told me the story that Pa had an eye for the women on the beach, and if Susie caught him, she would chase him with a piece of a cut-off garden hose. And I can attest that my family said there was a garden hose that she would use. This was a trolley stop, but you could get off right here. Later, there was roller skating, obviously dinners, shore dinners, and refreshments. And then in the 40s and 50s, this is where big bands played, and people came from all over Connecticut to come to Palmer's Casino to dance to these famous bands, Paul Whitman's band, Glenn Miller, and then later the Ink Spots, for an example. Admission was 10 cents. By the 1960s, the building became run down and was demolished in 1967. And this is a good view to talk about that all these buildings, these were wood buildings, some of them fairly large, before there was any kind of zoning. And it's really amazing there weren't tremendous number of fires or injuries, but only the Waverly is the one that had the fire to my knowledge. This was vacant land for many years, and only more recently in 2006, some Houses were erected on the property and Edgewater condominiums in 1980. Another little spot that you could rent was the Limewood Grove House. It was also called the Rice House or later the Thompson House. And that's this little section on the right with the trees. It was called Rice's Grove. Now this was open by 1880, so it really was early. And it was operated and owned by Elvira Pond from the Pond family that was the first settlers of Indian Neck. And her husband was George G. Rice, but she ran this operation. She conducted the Rice House or Limewood Grove House for nearly 60 years till 1940. In the 1940s, it became known as the Thompson House. It was operated by Mrs. Thompson of Hamden. I don't know her first name. And all these little spots that you could stay, the host or hostesses were very congenial, very friendly, and people came year after year to the same place because they were comfortable. There were home-cooked meals and a private beach, as you see from this postcard. Mrs. Thompson ran the inn till 1961. It was torn down, and then in 1986, the Breakers condominiums were built here. But again, here's a little place that was, people came for the summer, and it operated kind of quietly, but for 80 years, and provided a place to stay for people coming from the cities. Our last stop on Limewood Avenue is off to the right, and that's the Montowese Inn. The Montowese Inn was built about 1900. Now the inn is the one on the water side in the back in this photograph, and then the annex on the street side was built in 1902. It was 30 rooms and operated for 25 years by Olive White, summers only, June to October, and had rooms for 70 people. It cost $8 to $10 a week, and she did almost all the cooking. And again, back in the 70s, I talked to some people that used to come here every year, and they said she was very congenial, very cordial, and the food was very good. One of those people was a woman that ended up moving to Branford, lived in Short Beach for many years, but she grew up in New Britain. And she said, again, her parents came to the Montowese every single year. And when she was a teenager, she finally ventured over to Palmer's Casino. But she said she only stayed about 10 minutes because she was afraid somebody was going to steal her pocketbook. After Mrs. White's death, the Montowese was operated by Joseph and Helen Perot of Hartford. She again was a wonderful cook, and it closed in 1960. The annex is still there, made into a house, though it's fairly modern, and you wouldn't necessarily recognize it. The porches are all gone because as the road was wide and a lot of houses lost their front porches. We're going to leave Limewood Avenue now. Again, note the trolley tracks along the beach side, and we're going to head west back to Sybil Avenue and down to Linden Avenue. Now, the first thing you come to, the first street, I think it's a little confusing which comes first, but the first is Cocheco Avenue, also called Cocheco Bluffs. Some people call it Cocheco. The name, we don't really know where the name came from, but there was a Cocheco cottage, and there's a river in New Hampshire with the same name, the only reference I could find to that name. The more expensive houses were on the direct waterfront, as not unlike today, and then the more modest cottages down the street. These were built around 1900, and you could rent the cottages on Cocheco Avenue. The next street is Soundview Heights. This was a planned development in 1910 with 28 lots for summer cottages. And this was managed by Reginald, or we knew him as Reggie Baldwin from Branford Center. He was the founder of the First Federal Bank. and he was also a real estate agent and managed the summer rentals on Soundview Heights. From this postcard, 1926, we are anchored here. Our cottage is idle hour, Soundview Heights. And again, you could rent one of these cottages on Soundview Heights, take a walk down to the water, down the stairwell, and have a swim, your daily swim. And even by the 20s, I'll note that the road still isn't paved. Now, paving in Branford started right after World War I for the most part, but Indian Neck and some of the shoreline areas were among the last to get their roads paved, to get electricity, and so on. So probably pretty muddy in the spring and summer when there was a rain. And then during that time, you could stroll the whole length of Linden Avenue. You can see the dirt path on the right, and then later it became paved. And you can also see that a lot of these houses shared or had private bathhouses or little docks where they could launch their boats. I'm very fond of this postcard because I like postcards that show people. In this case, this man relaxing, probably reading the newspaper. And off in front of us will be our next stop, and that is the Onigo House. The house in the back is the Betsy Pond House, built in 1812, and this is, again, to the best of my knowledge, the Pond family were the first people to live here year-round. Remember, this is before there's any roads coming down here. There was no transportation before the train and so on. And Elias Pond had a big farm here, and this was the farmhouse. This building in the back was torn down and replaced in the 1970s, a replica of the house, the original house. Now, David Lonsberry from Bethany, Connecticut, came to Branford when he married Ann Spencer of this town, and in the back house, he started taking boarders in 1847 and was quite successful. He named the establishment the Onigo. Now, Onigo was an Indian warrior, but not from even Connecticut. He must have liked the name. Perhaps it was a marketing tool, but Onigo, the Indian warrior, had nothing really to do with Branford. In 1867, he built the front building, which still stands today and is the main building for the Onigo. It cost $2 a week to stay, and by 1900, cost $10. After Daniel retired, his son Williams Lonsberry ran the Onigo again. It became extremely popular until his death in 1907. It was purchased in 1909 and operated till 1945 by Harry Stratton. And by 1945, it cost $50 a week to stay here. In 1936, postcard of we are having a good time at this quaint and quirky place. The surf is in front of the house, and we go bathing every afternoon. The food is good, especially the clams. And almost all these postcards say something about clams, so people loved eating these clams when they came to the shore. The beach in front became known as Stratton Beach, and here you can see the little breakwater that sort of separates the Onigo property from Soundview Heights and the seawall. And we'll mention again the 1938 hurricane. The Onigo lost 50 trees, all their bathhouses, and almost all of the seawall during that storm. After Stratton's retirement, there were a couple other owners. And then in 1950, the Onigo was purchased by Conrad Driscoll, an attorney from the center of Branford. He was known as Connie Driscoll. And then his wife was Jane Williams Driscoll, later Rosenthal, and she ran the Onigo for many, many years. And it's her family that still operates the Onigo today. During the Driscoll's ownership, it became a private beach club. But today it is still in operation. They do rent rooms. So it is the only of Branford's 19 summer hotels that's still in operation after 173 years. This postcard is incorrectly labeled Limewood Avenue. It's Linden Avenue. And we're going to go down to the very end of the dead-end street, Linden Avenue. And at the end, there were a couple important buildings, one of which was the Ace that you see here, one of my favorite postcards, a real photo postcard with this woman just taking a nice stroll down Linden Avenue. The Ace was named for Asahel Averill. The Averill family was from Montowese Street in Branford Center, but ended up doing a lot down here in Indian Neck, and his nickname was Ace. This was also called the Little Store or the Little Red Store. And the woman who ran this for many years was Miss Hinchcliffe. Some of the kids called her Pinch Pennies as a nickname. She was nice, but she was very strict and very orderly. But she made the best homemade hot fudge and marshmallow sauce, and a Sunday treat was a sundae for 15 cents. There were pinball machines, fresh milk, canned goods, fresh bread, and penny candy. The children used to go down below, and there were cracks in the floors, and sometimes they would find pennies on the rocks that fell through those cracks. The Ace had one of the few telephones around, and when one of the Clam Islanders got a phone call, Miss Hinchcliffe would pull a red shade down, and then a Clam Islander would get in their rowboat and row to shore in order to take their telephone call. Miss Hinchcliffe was here during the 38 hurricane. That's September 21st, 1938. And she was going to be in big trouble had she not been rescued by the Brock Hall milkman who brought her to a cottage across the street. The building survived. It was eventually abandoned and then finally wrecked in the Hurricane Donna in 1960. This is the end of Linden Avenue. You can see off to the right is the little store, the Ace. And then we're going to make one further stop down Linden Avenue to the far left with the building with the red roof. And that was called the Ark. Now the Ark, you can see underneath is a boat. It was 70 feet long. And this was a boat out of Sag Harbor, Long Island called the Jenny Lind. Now, we also have a Jenny Lind from Branford that's a few of the boards can be seen at low tide on Montowese Street. However, Jenny Lind was a famous Swedish opera singer promoted by P.T. Barnum, and she was called the Swedish Nightingale, and many boats were made for Jenny Lind, including this one. This boat was wrecked off of Sumac Island in 1878. It was 70 feet long, and what happened when these boats were wrecked, sometimes it was not financially feasible for the owners of the boat to, if the boat sunk, to have it brought back up, for example. And that's what happened here. George Averill laid claim to the boat. He towed it ashore, added the second floor, and made it into a restaurant and bar. It had a dining room, was famous for its shore dinners. And this really catered to men, businessmen. There was a smoking room, a music room, kitchen, and a store. John Averill, his brother, was a good cook. They would have fish bakes and duck hunting parties. But then there was also another side. Grace Averill, a member of that family, wrote in a postcard in 1912 with a picture of the Ark. She says to her friend, "I am worn out. I'll be glad when the season is over." Signed, Grace Averill. So the Ark was a hangout for businessmen, for politicians. The Branford Battery out of the Branford Armory used to have their maneuvers down here at Boston Park, and they would, of course, come for refreshments afterwards and a shore dinner. In 1920, the Ark was made into a cottage, and then during the 38 hurricane, Cliff Collins, a local fisherman and lobsterman whose house and lobster shack was on the other side of this peninsula overlooking Maltby Cove, his boat Sally smashed into the Ark, splitting it in half. One half went off to Sunset Beach, was made into a cottage. The remainder stayed here and was a cottage. but a lot of the houses down here at the end of Linden Avenue in the last 25 years have been torn down and more modern buildings built in its place. Now on this Indian Neck Peninsula is Pawson Park. Now where is Pawson Park really? Pawson Park is the northern half of the Indian Neck Peninsula overlooking the meadows. So if you're at Lenny's restaurant looking at the meadows, Pawson Park is kind of what you see looking out that back deck. Now, Branford was owned by the proprietors or the residents of the town and the selectmen. There was a board of selectmen just like today, and they divided the land and sold the land and purchased the land. But Indian Neck, the peninsula, was different. The church bought this land directly from the native people. I mentioned that the last bit of this land was sold by Pawson, the Totoket sachem, in 1735. So it's the church that owned this land, and the business arm of the First Congregational Church was called the First Ecclesiastical Society. And they leased the land some of this land in 1866 to Sam Beach of East Main Street in Branford for 99 years for $900 a year. And at that time, people thought the Beach was crazy and that he paid way too much to lease this land. Sam Beach at first did farming here. He grazed sheep and then started building some cottages. And then in 1884, he named it Pawson Park, named for that last Totoket sachem, and he catered to day picnics and church groups. So it wasn't an amusement park per se, but it was a picnic ground. There was a restaurant, a tintype gallery. There were flying horses, roller skating, and steamboats out of New Haven, some of them quite large, holding 1,000 people, would come and drop people off at Pawson Park, at the Montowese House, and all along the Branford shore. No alcohol was ever allowed at Pawson Park. Pawson Park was then subleased to Frederick Averill of that Averill family, and the amusement park part of Pawson Park stopped at that time. Averill subdivided the lots. Again, he didn't own the land, he just leased the land, and many more cottages were built. So then Pawson Park became really a cottage community for the summer. So all those years, the people of Pawson Park owned their cottage, but never owned the land where their cottage sat. And in 1950, the First Ecclesiastical Society began selling the land on the Indian Neck Peninsula to the people whose cottages stood on their land. And that's the arrangement today. The people do own their land and their cottage. Now, the Pawson Park as a resort ended before Postcards. So there's really no postcards and very few photographs of the amusement park or the resort called Pawson Park. The one few that there is this one of the Pawson Inn. And in 1902, land was leased by the First Ecclesiastical Society to the Trinity Church of New Haven, and they built the Trinity Vacation Home, but they only kept it for about a decade, and then it became an inn. They kept it for only 4 years, and then sold it in 1906, and it became an inn called the Pawson Inn, and that operated for about 1 decade. From this 1916 postcard, I am here at the Pawson Inn. There is a beautiful rose bush by the chimney full of blossoms. It sits on a bluff overlooking Long Island Sound. The Hitchcock family that owned Atlantic Wire purchased the Pawson Inn in 1918. They owned it for several decades and enjoyed their stay at this building for the summers in Indian Neck, eventually selling it, but is still a house today in Pawson Park. Now, not only do we have Indian Neck, Branford is divided into all these little neighborhood and communities, all of which have their own little history, their own timelines. But within Indian Neck, there's also other little places in Indian Neck, one of which is Summer Island. This was First Ecclesiastical Society land that was subdivided and cottages built in the early 1900s. And these cottages face south. And before the cottages were built, there was always boat building activity here. Peter Oppel built boats and stored boats. Jarvis Averill had an oyster dock and had sold oysters from Summer Island. And then later, Elmer Tyler had his boats here, and his boat, Bob White, is still abandoned along Summer Island, disintegrating through nature in the storms, but is sort of a landmark down at Summer Island and well photographed by people passing by. Besides those large steamers coming out of New Haven, you could also take a little steamer, such as this one, the Dorothy, to these little sections, including Summer Island, and get dropped off to your cottage. So each of these little sections, including Summer Island, have their own history. And in Summer Island, and in Summer, have their own history, and families came generation after generation. To Summer Island. In Summer Island, there were cottage names: the Dog House, the Outlook, Beaconhurst, Idle Seat, or Cozy Nook. Between Summer Island and Sunset Beach was Page's Point. That was originally called Jeffrey's Point after one of the Totoket Indians, or Indian Point. Next is Sunset Beach. Sunset Beach sits on Sagamore Cove. This was, again, First Ecclesiastical Society land. These cottages were also built in the early 1900s, but they face west. And they did not use cottage names like they did at Summer Island. And there was a different sort of clientele that came to Sunset Beach. These cottages were built by businessmen from Branford, such as the Toole family, the Mortons, Hawsley, Covert, and the Jordan family. And so from a 1913 postcard, this was sent to Sidney V. Osborne in Branford. Please deliver as soon as possible $1 worth of wood to the Toole Cottage, Sunset Beach, Indian Neck. Sunset Beach was hit very hard in the 38 hurricane, again, facing west. These cottages were right on the beach, and many of them were wrecked and destroyed. At Sunset Beach, in more recent years, a good number of these cottages have been torn down and new, more modern houses built in their place. Now, besides Green Island, there's, of course, many, many rocks off of Indian Neck, all of which are a hazard to boaters. And it's amazing how many boat wrecks there were off Indian Neck through the years. Two other islands are inhabited off of Indian Neck. One is Clam Island and the other is Sumac. Now, Clam sits off of Summer Island and it's the farthest east of the two islands. And these cottages have had many owners through the years. Clam Island was developed in 1891 by the Savage and Wilcox families, and the Summer Islanders called them the Out Islanders. They have a parking lot at the end of Linden Avenue, which is very handy. Now, except for the Boyd Cottage, which burned in 1948, almost all these cottages look the same as they've always looked. The cottagers owned the land that their cottage sits, but jointly owned the dock and other public right-of-ways. Island life, of course, is not for everybody. It can be challenging. You have to get there, bring your supplies. There's a lot of thought that has to go into it. High maintenance, but it's a way of life that some people love. This is, again, a real photo postcard, a one of a kind, just marked Clam Island, Branford, and this cottage is still there on Clam Island. A number of years ago, I heard from one of the descendants of the Wilcox family that first settled and built these cottages on Clam Island. and several generations of the Wilcox family came to Clam Island. And he said daily life on Clam Island was only about fishing, digging for clams for chowder, and opening and eating oysters raw. The other island is Sumac. Now, Sumac and a small island uninhabited in Clam make the Spectacle Islands. And the small island and Clam are the eyeglasses of the Spectacle, and Sumac is the nose. These were also called the Indian Neck Islands. And these terms, both Clam, Sumac, Spectacle, and Indian Neck Islands, were used by the colonists since the very beginning when they started subdividing and parceling out these islands. Now, Sumac was owned by two different people. In the middle of this postcard, you can see there's a little fishing shack. That was owned by Edmund Zacher, an attorney in Branford Center, and Henry Lindsley of Branford Center, who was the postmaster. And they would put on their overalls and pretend they were roughing it and go fishing out here on Sumac Island. The right-hand part was owned separately. Finally, the Zacher Lindsley portion was sold, and the island for many years now has been owned by one person. The largest part was owned and purchased in 1896 by John Anderson of New Haven, and he was a wealthy tobacco dealer, and he built this mansion. The contractor was Richard Bradley of Branford Center, who built a lot of summer cottages, and he also built this long stone pier. Soon after he finished this building, which took several years to build, he was out there with his wife and family, and there was a very bad summer storm, and the wife refused to ever come back, and she never did. So this stood vacant for quite a few years. Even though this is a large building, and I'm sure it was called a mansion at the time, it really is kind of a confusing architectural building. Lot of stuff going on here. The mansion was sold in 1907 to Thomas Lenehan of New Haven, and he was a national maker of caskets. The mansion was torn down in 1937. The Depression was not kind to the shoreline and to these really big mansions along the shoreline, and it was by then considered a white elephant and had very little monetary value. In the 1950s, Marston Lincoln of Summer Island built a little low stone house on Sumac Island using stones that had crumbled from the pier. That was torn down, and in 2006, a very large house was built and stands today brought over by barge, which caused quite a creation here in Branford. And so your vacation to Indian Neck is almost over, but we're going to make one last stop, and that's to the Montowese House. The Montowese House was called the Queen of the Sound. It was built in 1865 by William Bryant of Branford Center. He first built and operated the Thimble Island House, also known as the Pot Island House, over in Stony Creek. And this was the largest hotel between Newport and New York City, had 200 rooms on 25 acres and a dining room that could sit 250 people. The Montowese House catered to a wealthier clientele. People would come for the whole summer, bring their maids, and the livery man would pick you up at the train station. But if you were wealthy, your luggage never came in the same wagon with you, only in a separate wagon. And of course, your maid also came in a separate wagon. This became so popular that the Bryan family bought the Trowbridge summer cottage, seen to the left in this picture that still stands today, and used it as the annex to the hotel. People came for a week, a month, or often, as I mentioned, for the whole summer, and the same people often came year after year. The Montowese, as it was called for short, was known for fabulous food, relaxation, boating, swimming. It had a horse rink and stables, a small golf course, water skiing, tennis, croquet, and bathhouses. In 1911, Postcard. This is the largest hotel for miles. I'm here for 2 weeks. There are lots of girls here, and it is fine. I go sailing almost every day. And besides the annex, the Bryants had their own house overlooking the water, as you can see on the left, and that building is still there today. And in the evening, you could take this lovely stroll the whole length of Linden Avenue in front of the Montowese House. And here's one of the small piers in front of the hotel where you could bring up your small boat or sailboat or go down to the beach. In 1938, fortunately, the Montowese House had closed for the season. Again, it was September 21st. And for the most part, the summer season ended at Labor Day, so all the guests had left. The Montowese House lost 300 trees on their property during that storm, and only one nicked a corner of the roof. And the Bryan family used that wood, cut it up instead of burning it, and used it to build the Montowese Playhouse, which some of you may remember with Summer Stock Theater for quite a number of years. Also, during that storm, Linden Avenue in front of the Montowese House collapsed. And that happened again in Gloria. And then there was a problem also again during Irene for Linden Avenue collapsing underneath. The Montowese House always had this nice grouping of bathhouses. Those were all ripped out during the 38 hurricane, and they had to rebuild these bathhouses during almost every storm. There were 3 or 4 major hurricanes during the 1960s. The bathhouses were all gone after those and had to be rebuilt. Now, many other events took place at the Montowese House. For example, the Trinity Church Fair started in 1907 and for a number of years was on the front lawn of the Montowese House and not on the Branford Green. In the 1950s, Yale classes had all their reunions here at the Montowese House. In the 1950s, it was known for its dancing, bridge tournaments, and so on. Many famous people came and stayed at the Montowese House. Dean Acheson, Thorne Smith, who was an author, Vice President James Sherman, Kirk Allen, who was one of the first actors to play Tarzan in the movies, Agnes DeMille, the wit Dorothy Parker, and the most famous of all was Mark Twain, of course. He was a personal friend of William Bryan Jr. They played tennis together. And Mark Twain had his own private room at the Montowese House and a custom-made copper bathtub. Mark Twain was a very tall man, and they custom-made a bathtub for his use. And then in the early 1960s, Bob Dylan, one of his first performances, was here at the Montowese House for the Indian Neck Folk Festival, which ran for a few years. So the Montowese House was on leased land owned by the First Ecclesiastical Society, and the lease was not renewed, and in 1963, the Montowese House had closed. It was run by 4 generations of the Bryan family for 98 years, and it was torn down. The land was vacant until 1986, when the Linden Shores housing development was built. And again, the time by the 1960s and even after World War II, the era of coming to the shore to spend the summer really had ended. People wanted to take their automobiles, go to Yellowstone, go out west. And so this was sort of the final blow to the summer resorts of Branford. And one of my favorite postcards is this one of 2 women sitting in front of the Montowese House looking out to Sumac Island. And it leads me to the belief, did people relax more then than we do now? Or did they have stressors of just a different kind? So I hope you enjoyed your vacation at Indian Neck, and no doubt you'll come back next year. And I'll leave you with, I would say, sort of the back end of the postcard that I showed you at the beginning. Thank you for joining me this evening. it would be very difficult to put together a postcard collection that I've been working on for 45 years. And so the Branford Historical Society, also available at the Blackstone Library, I've put together 120 digital images of the best postcards of Indian Neck. Those are for sale. You can make them part of your desktop. You can look at them. They're not copyrighted. And so go to the Branford Historical Society website, or the Blackstone Library if that interests you. And also you could send us your comments or questions. For example, I have a question for the audience. Can anyone tell me more about the Indian Neck Folk Festival that ran in the early 1960s? Very little in the newspaper about it. I tried to find some people involved and they never got back to me. Of course, all these people are getting much older. I would love to hear more from you about that. Thank you again to the Historical Society and the Blackstone Library for hosting this program. And I'll turn it now over to Jenna.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane. So we have one question here. Can you talk a little bit more about the trolley tracks and how far they extended into Indian Neck and where were the stops? And
okay.
That kind of thing?
Yes, the trolleys came, out of New Haven. They were from Massachusetts and came down to New Haven. And the Branford line was built in 1900 to Branford Center. So you would come through East Haven, through the meadows where the trolley museum is today, through Short Beach. So the trolleys in Short Beach were built before Indian Neck to Branford Center. And then the trolley line was extended to Indian Neck and Pine Orchard in 1906. So a few years later, and then ultimately it was a different company. They extended the trolley line to Stony Creek and Guilford. And remember this, the trolley lines, though they were started in 1900, they really only lasted about 35 years because of the automobile. And it was very expensive to have the trolley, but it was the way everybody got around.
Okay, I have one other question. Someone wants to know about the Montgomery House. Do you know anything about that one?
The Montgomery House on Linden Avenue. I know I would have to look at my notes. The family name was Montgomery, and that's why Montgomery Parkway, the little road off of behind Linden Avenue, is so named, but I would have to look up those details off the top of my head. I can't tell you anymore.
Okay. I think, Matt, did you have some questions?
I apologize for my phone ringing. I thought I'd shut it off, but I
Oh, no worries. Happens all the time.
live and learn.
It's a whole new
So
ballgame.
again, if people can share online or drop a note, however you want to do it, what happened to the little dairy bar on Limewood Avenue? Does anyone remember? Was it destroyed in a storm? Did it just get torn down? Can somebody share memories about the Yale store? All these things are just great. And as time goes on, there'll be less people that remember some of these things.
Someone had a question about the rink.
The rink up in Pawson Park. Yes, the rink was part of the Beach family Pawson Park summer resort. Again, there was a merry-go-round, which they called the Flying Horse at that time. And then they had the rink, which was made into a house that sits up on Wakefield Road, overlooking the Branford Point from that vantage point. And so that was called the rink. We do have a couple photographs. There's very few photographs of that era of the 1880s when Pawson Park was a summer resort.
Okay, so the person who asked about the rink, apparently their grandparents purchased it in the 70s. Do you know anything about it prior to that?
It was when Pawson Park ceased to be, as I mentioned, ceased to be the day picnic ground area. Some of those buildings were converted to summer homes, and that's what happened to the rink. It became the summer cottage and then a year-round cottage. And then when the family bought it and renovated it, they uncovered the sign. It was all covered up that said the rink. So it had long been a cottage. Again, Pawson Park as a summer resort ended by 1904. So all those buildings became cottages.
I think we had one other one. Someone here does know about the Dairy J.
Okay, that'd be great if they would go to the Historical Society for an email or send me a note, send the society a note. That would be fantastic. Unless they've shared it in chat.
Oh yeah, Jane, do you want me to put your email address in the chat?
Yeah,
or is there a good
that'd be
email
fine.
there?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure. I think it's let's see if I can remember.
Bouley 61.
That's what it is. Okay, I'm gonna send that to everyone in the chat. So if you have any tidbits for Jane or any in-depth questions, you can find her email in the chat. Matt, I know you had some stuff you wanted to say. Unfortunately, I cannot unmute you. I think you have to unmute yourself. There. Oh. Yeah.
There I go. Okay, great. Thanks so much. A couple notes, Jane, like tidbits I've heard other places and I've never heard confirmation one way or the other. You talked about the Betsy Pond House.
Mhm.
Is that the one that might have been raided by the British during the War of 1812 when they came ashore in Branford?
No, I've never heard that. The British may be raided. Again, it's a little hard with folklore to
Yeah.
confirm some of these things. Raided in Lanfear's Cove to the Lanfear House overlooking Branford Point Harbor, and then also the Blackstone House on Hushes Grove on First Avenue. But I don't believe I've ever heard of them coming ashore to Indian Neck.
That's fascinating. Thanks so much for that. I actually
and that would be, why would they want to? Heaven's sakes, that that would have been trying for the British to try to come ashore there. And there really wasn't a lot going on in Indian Neck for them to want to raid that. So it doesn't make total sense to me. So I don't believe is probably a fact.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. That makes perfect sense. And I mean, the Dutch fort was long gone.
Yeah.
By then, and I was amazed very quickly about how the trolley tracks just look like two metal rails in the sand. They must have.
Oh my God! And again, I think it's worth pointing out again. How did they maintain those? You know the kinds of storms we have from time to time. Sometimes in the summer, winter. To maintain Limewood Avenue with all its sand and all the sand piling up, and it's all higher than it was. Limewood Avenue was lower than it is now because it's gotten built up over the years. So maintaining those trolley tracks, maintaining the road, making them passable really was a challenge.
Oh, and just maintaining the wires too. You think of the damage that must have happened during the hurricane of 38. I recall reading the hurricane of 38 when it came in gave really little warning. So people were just stuck in their houses. And so the fact that was it your grandfather or your father who went down to help pull boats?
My uncle, yeah.
Your uncle. That's amazing because it just came on them from everything I've read. Let's see. And you mentioned the Oasis restaurant. Is that the one that was on top of Branford Hill?
No, that was the Summit House. The Oasis was originally in the center of Branford, but it was very popular. Their seafood was, renowned. And then it moved out, which is where I remember it, out East Main Street. And then it burned. And the site of that old Oasis restaurant out East Main Street is now the Methodist Church.
Oh, very interesting. I was wondering how that land was open.
Yeah. So it was the Summit House that you're thinking of that was at the top of Branford Hills.
Okay, well, thanks. That's the name. And every time I pass by Montgomery Parkway, I laugh because they call it a parkway, and it's only
Oh,
about
yeah, it's not,
100 feet
it
long.
sounds fancy, doesn't it? But what, there's like 4 houses on it.
Yeah, it is a final note about your talk. The rink. What's the status of that? Because
I've heard conflicting things. I've had a few phone calls about that it's recently been sold and the new owners are possibly going to tear it down, but I can't confirm that one way or another.
okay, well, we'll keep an eye out on the demolition notices. We get those. Okay, I think that's all the thoughts I had. So thanks so much. My family only moved here in 1969, so all this stuff that you're talking about is fascinating to me for the long history of this stuff. So I don't know if Mike Russo wants to say anything. Mike, if you do, you can go ahead and chat in. But I want to thank Mike, our program coordinator, for setting all this up, and Jane, of course, for giving the talk, and the Blackstone Library for organizing this and facilitating it for us. I saw that we had almost 100 participants, which is great. And I think that's all I have, except to say that at the beginning, when I was greeting people, I was reminding members to go ahead and get their membership renewals in early and add a little donation if you like. But for those people who are listening who are not members, please do go to the website. It's right on the screen, BranfordHistoricalSociety.org, and please take out a membership. Of course, it's not just your money we want, it's your involvement for things like the Strawberry Festival when that's back better than ever next year. And that's all I have. Jane, thank you again.
Okay,
And,
thank you,
lots of luck.
thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you guys. Thank you everyone for attending. I think that wraps us up. So we'll see you next time. I'll be sending the link to the YouTube recording to everybody who registered, and you can feel free to share that amongst anyone you like. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.